anyone who's been paying attention to the news for the past few months knows that the rise of artificial intelligence, or at least the it's going public, right? It's been in development for years, and we've been using it in various ways, for years. But the release, I guess it was in November, of ChatGPT by OpenAI, followed soon thereafter by Google releasing the prototype of their Bard chatbot. That the fact that these were released to the public and people started using them and began to see how powerful they were, potentially for good and bad, has been really the talk of the year, right? I mean, there's been quite a lot of media hype and quite a lot of media fog around AI. Some prominent members of the tech community are warning that it presents an existential threat to humanity. So there's quite a lot of buzz around this. And in the article, I start out by admitting that, yes, definitely, this is the going public of AI and the integration of artificial intelligence into our economy, into our culture, into many social functions does represent a significant technological sea change. Whether that is similar to the introduction of the automobile or the introduction of fire, there's an argument, right? Some are calling it a Promethean moment, right? That'll change humanity forever. Part of what the article does is try to take down that argument a notch, by pointing out how much of the most alarming predictions are based on an underlying metaphysical assumption that the current versions of artificial intelligence, most prominently the large language models, or LLMs as they're called, that are behind the chatbots, that there's this assumption that's driven by transhumanism and physicalism and all kinds of reductive philosophies of mind that are kind of converging to confirm that if artificial intelligence isn't already some kind of alien intelligence, some kind of self-aware agent, then it'll soon become one. That it's just a matter of time. It's not the question of whether, it's a question of when artificial intelligence will become a self-acting agent. And to illustrate the power of this narrative about the coming, what's known in at least the transhuman movement as the singularity, right? And there's different ways in which the singularity is conceived. Probably the most famous is that of the futurist Ray Kurzweil, who has gotten a lot of attention and prestige. His book, The Singularity is Near, came out several years ago, predicted that machines are not only going to become generally intelligent, that is, super intelligent, able to do anything a human can do, aware of themselves, pursuing their own purposes, but that this is going to constitute, in some ways, the obsolescence of humanity. That the singularity is when a new era of evolution emerges. I mean, maybe I'm not doing full justice to Kurzweil's thesis, but most of you have probably heard of the singularity in one or more of its incarnations. And a strong proponent of this narrative of the coming transformation of reality into machine intelligence is Yuval Harari. I'm just going to share my screen really quick if you'll let me. So I have this screenshot. This is Harari's latest YouTube video. Came out on, I guess, late May. It's already got 1.2 million views and 30,000 likes. He's giving a talk at a climate change conference, but basically he just talks about the coming singularity and the significance of AI. And the quote that I use at the beginning of the article to kind of frame Harari's position and that of many other physicalists and people in the tech community is this one: for 4 billion years, the ecological system of planet Earth contained only organic life forms. And now, or soon, we might see the emergence of the first inorganic life forms in 4 billion years, or at the very least, the emergence of inorganic agents, right? Later in the article, I point out that there is a certain degree of irony regarding, the physicalist, the family of views which believe that the universe is simply matter in motion, that the universe is just one thing, it's physical, and that everything in the universe can ultimately be reduced to chemistry or even physics. And this physicalist view assumes that, as Harari articulates, that machines will soon become inorganic agents. And at the same time, many prominent physicalists, Harari included, another notable one is Sam Harris, have been claiming, with stern confidence that free will is a complete illusion. So the fact that humans can't have free will, but artificial intelligence can, is a highly ironic proposition. It also represents some significant threats to our culture, to our democracy, to our common spaces, to the danger of artificially intelligent weapons. I mean, there's all kinds of real problems that we can predict or at least be concerned about that can already be propagated with the current LLM models, right? So AI doesn't have to become significantly more developed for the threats to be of concern. And so they certainly are. And I'm not trying to downplay any of those. But this article is more about the philosophical implications of the rise of AI. And I'm, among I think the many benefits that AI, if we can, manage to contain the threats, many of the benefits that the current or, sort of the immediate horizon of development within the current generation of LLMs, that promises to benefit us in all kinds of ways. As I said a couple of months ago in this meeting, I think the best comparison is to the emergence of horsepower, right? First with locomotive steam engines and then with gasoline-powered engines. That gave humanity all kinds of new mobility, all kinds of power. It created problems and threats, and both by people getting run over and by our suburban infrastructure being designed around the car. I mean, so there's widespread social implications for the emergence of personalized horsepower. And I think an analogy for at least this LLM version of artificial intelligence is that it provides a kind of mind power that it can empower us in all kinds of ways, and like anything, any powerful tool, it can do damage. But the point is that even though it will inevitably improve and get quote smarter, from a philosophical point of view, I marshal arguments and reasons for why artificial intelligence cannot become the kind of inorganic agent that Harari so confidently predicts. And so the part of the reason why this idea, I refer to it by the acronym AGI, Artificial General Intelligence. And there's quite a few definitions. It's sort of a battleground right now about what constitutes artificial general intelligence. Some define the bar very low, in which case we could perhaps argue that there's some tasks for which the current models demonstrate a kind of general intelligence. Certainly chatbots can talk about anything. But if we really appreciate what this hope for artificial general intelligence means, then we can appreciate that it means that basically there's a degree of self-awareness, there's a degree of independent intention, there's an ability to be self-reflective, to self-correct. There's a whole universe of abilities and behaviors that humans exhibit and that we take for granted that really need to be duplicated for the artificial general intelligence in its fullness to come about. Right, so even something as immediately predictable and in partial operation right now is like self-driving cars. At least according to some reports, because there's so many potential contingencies in real-world driving conditions, while certainly there are places that can be cordoned off for the safe operation of the current generation of artificial intelligence applied to self-driving cars, there are ways in which this kind of next step of artificial general intelligence is is necessary for self-driving cars to be thoroughly autonomous and, generally more safe than your average driver, which maybe is not as large a threshold as we might imagine. But nevertheless, without going into a full discourse on the subtleties of what artificial general intelligence entails and what tests we might apply for whether or not it's been reached, if artificial general intelligence, I think, as I argue in the article, means anything, it's the ability to understand the meaning of the inputs and the outputs. And meaning itself is tied to experience. Again, this is another argument that I'm just going to assert here without thoroughly unpacking. But if you don't have an ability to experience, then that is a ceiling to the operation of your cognition or its cognition in all kinds of ways. And this ability to experience is something that is the product of billions of years of evolution, that it's an achievement of evolutionary emergence. And by looking at the actual history of evolutionary emergence, what science has revealed about the last 13 billion years of evolution is that we can't draw a straight line from matter to mind. That while we don't have to adopt a kind of dualistic philosophy that says matter and mind are totally separate things, there's ways to think about them as just different aspects of the same thing. But the idea that that our conscious mental experience, that all the stuff that we take for granted, the tacit nature of human knowledge, the fact that what it means to be conscious comes from being embodied and growing up in a society, right? There's all kinds of ways that we're just kind of using those elements of our consciousness that we take for granted, but which can't be duplicated by a form of cognition that's created through computation, right? Now, those who would dispute my argument, physicalists like Harari, would say that no, in fact, that we're very close to machines becoming conscious in a way that may not be exactly the same as what it means to be conscious as a human, but that machines will become conscious in a way that they will become self-acting, they will have experience, they will understand what meaning is, and they'll be able to get a grasp on all the tacit dimensions and intuitive elements of what we take for granted in our own consciousness. And so I mentioned that in order to do that, you need to adopt some version. There's a whole bunch of them in this family of physicalism. Reductive physicalism is sometimes called. I mean, there's even non-reductive physicalism. So it's hard to come up with one label for this family of views that can't be accepted or disputed. But in general, the philosophy of mind that mind is identical with brain, that your brain creates consciousness and that consciousness is ultimately physical, and that the way that this illusion of interiority that we apparently have, that what it's like to be something, right? The technical philosophical word is qualia. In other words, when you look at red, there's something about redness that has a feeling that goes with it. And it's not just some, 0 to 1 byte that says red, not red, right? Anyway, the thinking here is that consciousness is a form of computation, and that the brain is creating consciousness as a result of its neural network computation. The physical synapses are firing, and this is what's creating computation. And this view that mind is identical with brain, I mean, it's in some ways the prevailing view. It's the prevailing view in the philosophy of mind. It's the prevailing view in almost all professional philosophy in Western academia. It's the prevailing view in the tech community. Some of the most prominent thought leaders in our culture today are hardcore physicalists, right? I mentioned Sam Harris, but there are many others that we can point to. There's almost like a spirit of it that, if you're a serious intellectual, like, Jonathan Haidt, another person whose thinking I admire greatly, but having spent time with him, Carter and I spent time with him, we saw how much there's a tribe. It's almost like an ideology of physicalism that you can't be caught contradicting. right? That once you're outside this kind of club of sensible, realistic people who don't believe in woo-woo, then you're cast out of the club, right? So there's a lot of social pressure. There's a real membrane that validates the physicalist philosophy in ways that have nothing to do with the validity of its arguments, right? A lot of it has to do with historical hangover from history, pushing off against religion, right? Embracing a secular worldview that didn't involve anything supernatural was a way of being a grown-up, right? This is the chief theme of one of the masterworks of philosophy of the last few decades, and that is The Secular Age by Charles Taylor. Right? He talks quite a lot about how being a physicalist, it means being serious, and that otherwise you've embraced fairy tales and you can't be taken seriously. And I've personally been stung in many times in my travels and work as an author. The fact that I'm not a physicalist has closed quite a few doors to me, right? So this I just want to give it its due and say that there, although I think it's badly mistaken, there are a lot of people, very smart people of good sense and good faith, who ascribe to this philosophy. So I don't want to just ridicule it. I want to try to steelman it. Although ultimately I think it's ridiculous. So another element of the argument is this idea that mind is created by computation depends on this idea of a gradient, that there's a seamless continuum between matter, atoms, matter and energy, time and space, and mind, and that I evoke the what we know about evolution, the three big bangs, right? The first big bang, the second big bang of the emergence of life, right? Where there's discontinuity. Physicalists kind of downplay this. They kind of pretend that DNA will soon be explained in physicalist terms. And it certainly is a physical thing, but its emergence has never been duplicated, right? They spent billions of dollars. It's been 70 years since the first laboratory experiments in the 50s that got that produced the early conditions of the Earth and found that RNA molecules spontaneously emerged. And they assumed, of course, we can get RNA to emerge. DNA comes right after it. So we'll just keep playing with the early Earth and keep playing around. And, maybe we'll try to create the conditions of the vents on the seafloor or all kinds of different. And it's just a matter of time. Lightning strikes. It's just a matter of time till we unlock the physical code that shows how DNA emerges, accidentally, so to speak. But the DNA molecule, it reminds me of that cartoon. You've probably seen it. There's this mathematician. He's got a blackboard and he's got all these complicated equations, and the equations are filling the blackboard. And at the very bottom, he writes, and then a miracle occurs. And so the DNA molecule is a lot like that, because it is like an RNA molecule is maybe like a tweet, and a DNA molecule is like the Encyclopedia Britannica in terms of the difference of the information. And not only is it saturated with this massive amount of information, but the molecule itself comes with a reader that can read the information. So the DNA molecule is fantastic. I'm not making any claims of intelligent design. I'm just saying it's unaccounted for in the physicalist narrative. And I make the case that the same goes for the emergence of humanity. I quote Michael Hauser, I think his name is, the prominent evolutionary biologist, who claims that cognitively the difference between humans and chimps is greater than the difference between chimps and worms. And kind of what he means by that is that that physically, our bodies are only incrementally different from that of a chimpanzee, right? We share whatever it is, 98% of the same DNA. So according to natural selection, this is just one more mutation that was selected for, and that it can be perfectly explained as part of a biological continuum. However, what natural selection doesn't explain is that our minds are at an entirely different level, right? That's a great anomaly of neo-Darwinism, is that the human mind is not incrementally different from the minds of other primates. Again, this is another gigantic discontinuity that's downplayed, within the scientific philosophical discourse. But if we're going to have a philosophy of physicalism, and we're going to use that to make predictions about the dangers of AI, and we're going to sign various letters that say this is an existential threat to humanity, and all kinds of other, I would say, misunderstandings of what this technology is, then it's worth questioning the assumptions of physicalism. And one of those is this idea of a gradient between simple forms of matter and complex forms of thought. So then after I make those arguments, I then point out that the limits, I mean, again, there's a big media hype, big media fog. Many of the proponents of this hype are financially interested. I don't think that they're doing so disingenuously. I think they believe what they're saying. But nevertheless, for example, if you want media attention, being able to say you have a doomsday machine could be kind of helpful, right? So there's all kinds of sort of unrestrained excitement about the potential and the fact that our current LLMs are very near this predicted breakthrough of inorganic agents. And I point out some of the that's what I call the minority report in the press, some that try to debunk claims of the sparks of general artificial intelligence that have been claimed by Microsoft, as well as other informed technologists who definitely assume that AGI is coming, but they still predict that the current models, even in their near-term improvements, will reach a plateau. I cite some nerdy thinkers on that. So I try to say, look, let's not, I'm not trying to say that artificial intelligence is not huge, that it's a breakthrough technology, that it's going to transform our society, that it has major threats. I'm not trying to downplay any of that. I'm just trying to say that it's important not to get caught up in the hyperbola that dominates the media space at the moment. Which leads me to the final section of the article, where I say that the finding of these limits, which are all already appearing now, will actually be a boon for our understanding of what humans are. And this goes back to the idea of human specialness, right? I quote in several places in the article Jaron Lanier, who's another Silicon Valley guru, sort of like Harari. He gets a lot of media, right? He was interviewed on 60 Minutes and the New Yorker, and he's a kind of darling of the media right now. And he's being asked all about AGI, and he is pretty adamant. This is that, that quote I use is the best way to mismanage a technology is to misunderstand it. And he argues that that humans have a mystical interiority. I suspect he's read Ken Wilber. I think that's where he gets that term. But he also mentions that that there's something special about humans, and of course, he doesn't use the term anthropocentric, but there are many voices, especially in the science community, for whom anthropocentrism it's sort of monstrously arrogant. For us to think that we're somehow special, right? That we're just, this one little species in the tiny corner, dusty corner of the Milky Way, and that human specialness is some worn out notion of kind of biblical idea of us being, stewards of the planet, and then it's led to all kinds of abuse. So there are plenty of narratives from many different corners of our culture that attack and try to discredit any notions of anthropocentrism, and that sort of bringing humans down, making us humble. As Aldo Leopold said, we're just plain members of the biological community, right? But I think that's highly reductive, and I reject that. I think that in the article, I say that while earlier forms of anthropocentrism, which justified environmental degradation and human hubris, certainly are something we want to grow out of, but the idea that humans are special has an enduring quality and indeed a central philosophical importance for many reasons. And so the finding the limits of AI, especially in the face of all this hype that says it's going to surpass us soon, and this kind of recognition that there are certain ways in which humans are special, and that which, however strong our computation gets, it's not going to be able to duplicate these abilities. this begins to frame in more powerful ways why we are justified in recognizing our special moral standing in the scheme of evolution, right? That doesn't mean that that we're the complete end of evolution, nor does it mean that we can exploit the environment or treat it instrumentally or each other or whatever. But it does mean that we have there's something inside of us, as I argue in The Presence of the Infinite, my 2015 book, that because we can see intrinsic value, we can have spiritual experience, we can know what it's like to feel beauty, to create beauty and truth and goodness, that this ability is a kind of this ability to recognize these forms of spiritual experience. As I put it, it takes the infinite to see the infinite. And so I think there are interesting pieces of evidence that point to something inside humans that makes us morally special, that makes us agents of evolution, that gives us relatively free will, that means that our minds are at a higher level than any other form of animal, and that points to our purpose in the evolving universe, at least at this moment in the structure of emergence, and that is to serve as agents of evolution, right? To serve as vehicles that for way evolution can experience itself, right? Terence Deacon, who's an arch physicalist, nevertheless says that to be human is to know what it feels like to be evolution happening. And so, I think that this recognition of us as agents of evolution, right? As I say that we are bearers of the universe's teleology, right? You might dispute whether or not the universe has a purpose, but there's certainly purpose in evolution because we all have it. And AI can help underscore the authenticity and the non-physicality of that free will purpose, which I believe is a spiritual gift. So that's probably longer than I wanted, a kind of a rundown of the arguments in the article. But I want to just take another couple of minutes before we open it up for questions and comments to say a little bit about the philosophy of mind that has been, I think, developed further anywhere else within integral philosophy that gives me the confidence to make the claims that I do. And this idea that it starts with the idea that mind or consciousness, or perhaps we could just say interiority, right? A kind of sense of what it's like to be something or to be aware of things, to have to have experience of some kind that occurs, at least conceptually within an interior dimension, right? You can't point to experience, right? It's going on inside our head. And from a metaphysical point of view, this idea that mind is a fundamental, it's at least as fundamental as matter and energy and the laws of physics and mathematics, that it sort of goes all the way down and all the way back. And there's some that claim that the physical universe is just kind of an illusion and mind is really all there is. But let's just bracket that form of interiority for the moment to just focus on the strides that have been made within integral philosophy within recognizing this idea of interior universe. So, many of you will be familiar with this history of the philosophy of mind. The great religious traditions were very much about, the mind of God or a sort of idealistic version of things. But we have modernity, and it starts with René Descartes, right, in the 17th century. His famous, cogito ergo sum, I think therefore I am. His big breakthrough was to separate mind and matter, to be able to say, look, there's this physical world and it's extended, but then there's a realm. I mean, he unfortunately kind of framed it as natural and supernatural, and that's created problems ever since. But this idea that there are two realms and that how they interact isn't fully explained, that's been something that philosophers have been railing against ever since. And there's a variety of responses to this idea of dualism, various forms of what's known as monism, the idea there's just one thing. Some versions, like I mentioned, is the idea that there's just one thing and that's physical, right? It's just matter in motion. The opposite is there's just one thing and that's mind, right? Which, is we see in Hinduism and other religious philosophies. And then there's a third thing called, neutral monism, but I mean, this is kind of technical. I won't get into that. But an alternative which was popular in the 19th century and which has recently made a reappearance in mainstream professional philosophy, it goes by the unfortunate term of panpsychism, right? And there's variety versions of that. The most relevant to our discussion here is the version advanced by the founders of integral philosophy, namely Alfred North Whitehead and Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, both of whom adhered to some version of panpsychism. Teilhard's was kind of implied, but Whitehead's kind of served as the foundation of his entire philosophy. He posited that every natural structure has an interior, right? Not just life forms, but atoms. It goes all the way down. That as the universe emerges and complexifies, every structure that has a physical objective element has a corresponding interior subjective element. And there's been lots of debate around this, and Whitehead's philosophy of panpsychism has been refined and carried forward by other eminent philosophers like Charles Hartshorne, and David Ray Griffin has written quite a few academic books about it, arguing for it, at least the Whiteheadian version of it. He doesn't like the term panpsychism. He calls it pan-experientialism, which doesn't exactly roll off the tongue. But that version is highly technical, and because they're trying to respond to all kinds of attacks, it becomes a highly systematized, closed system that becomes less and less intuitively appealing. Right? Whitehead's metaphysics of he calls it the philosophy of organism. The occasions of experience, concrescence. It's all very woolly, and I think a little bit too tidy, a little bit too systematized. So I'm impressed by Whitehead, but I wouldn't say that I ascribe to his process philosophy in any kind of detail. However, Ken Wilber in the 1990s was very influenced by Whitehead, as well as many other evolutionary philosophers, most notably Arthur Koestler, who came up with this idea of holons. I mean, that idea had been around for a long time. Leibniz talks about monads, which are kind of close. But Koestler brings in an evolutionary component. Wilber adopts this. He kind of creates a fusion between that and Whitehead's metaphysics, coming up with what he calls his holonic ecology. And again, that's a lecture in itself. If you're interested, I would point you to Wilber's masterpiece, Sex, Ecology, Spirituality, where he talks about the 20 tenets of evolution, which are basically the behaviors of these whole parts, as they're known, holons. And he draws his 4-quadrant map based on the inside and outside and individual collective dimensions of this structure of holonic emergence. Okay, so that's getting pretty nerdy. But the point I just want to make about the background of this idea of interiority, which animates my thinking around artificial intelligence, is that we all have a direct experience of our own interior, right? There's a private space behind our eyes or in our hearts or wherever we want to locate it. I think it's been described as being non-local. So we can't just point to it as existing in a physical, bound space. But nevertheless, this interiority is something that we all kind of take for granted, right? That is, we all assume that we each have a similar kind of interiority, that we have intentions, that we are that we're thinking our thoughts, and that those thoughts are going on within each of us. So, it takes quite a bit of strong argument and quite a bit of credulity, I would say, to buy into the fact that this interior that we all experience in our own heads is somehow not real, that it's an illusion, right? It's very similar to the argument that our free will is an illusion, that we're just going along for the ride, that we don't have any choice. And of course, those are, I think, fallacies of physicalism in general. But one of the most amazing things, and I think powerful things about integral philosophy, is that it recognizes that this interior is not just subjective. The interior that we have, we not only are in the same space, here on planet Earth or in America or wherever we are bounded physically, we're also in a community that can be said to be authentically interior. right? This is the philosophical idea of intersubjectivity, not just the fact that we have joint commitments or agreements, but that our what we agree, our we space, as it's sometimes called, that there are actually real systems, that have that are dynamic systems that have a metabolism and that penetrate our minds and that rely on the subjective interiority of humanity to exist, but yet can't be reduced to just the subjective dimension, right? So this is a rather complex philosophical idea of a collective interior. Jung talked about the idea of the collective unconscious, but when he was pressed about whether this is really an ontological domain or just a metaphor, he kind of equivocated. He didn't advance a theory of full-blown ontological intersubjectivity, as has done Wilber and other integral philosophers, and that this is something that I'm writing about now in my next book, and I believe that it'll be a boon to our understanding of culture and consciousness and evolution. So it's extremely powerful and exciting. But in the same way that I don't fully buy into Whitehead's elaborate metaphysics of interior, recently I've gone back and read some of the elements of Wilber's elaborate philosophy of holons, right? The four quadrants, his claim that every holon has four quadrants. It gets very technical and nerdy. But back in the 2000s, when this was really started to catch on, in the early 2000s, there were two seminal academic papers written, one by Fred Kaufman called Holons, Heaps, and Artifacts, and another by Mark Edwards about the subject of holons. I can't remember the exact title. These are published on the website Integral World, which has since become quite a horrible place. But if you just Google those articles and don't read anything else on that website, you can find elaborate justifications and definitions and explanations of this idea of how holons have both an individual subjective interior and a collective intersubjective interior. But the more I read that now, the more I kind of feel like, okay, that might work perfectly for the biosphere, but it starts to break down and become forced when we talk about the interiority of humanity, and how that is not limited by our brains or by our culture. That the human mind can tap into vast reaches of the internal universe that go beyond anything that we may have been acculturated to appreciate, right? And anyone who's taken, for example, a proper dose of ayahuasca, for instance, that entheogenic substance, has seen this interior universe open up in a way that confirms how vast it is, and how that it's way beyond something that our mind is just creating. But that's probably beyond the pale for purposes of this conversation. But anyway, integral philosophy, I think, is very exciting. The fact that that it one of the foundations of it that really brought me into kind of joining the movement and defining myself and becoming an integral philosopher was just the confidence through which it could point out the fallacies of physicalism, right? At the beginning, Sex, Ecology, Spirituality, Wilber ridicules it. He calls it the philosophy of oops, right? Oops, there's a universe. Oops, there's humans. It's all an accident, right? Don't look for any larger meanings. It's just matter in motion. I mean, it just points out how crazy that is, just from a common sense point of view and from a deeply analytical philosophical point of view. When I read about his refutation of flatland, I've been thinking those thoughts myself. I just hadn't articulated them as well as Wilber. And that's what caused me to really dedicate my life to this philosophical movement back in 2000. So that's a mouthful. Thanks for letting me go on about that. And so let me just open it up for comments or objections or questions or